Welcome to the Continuity Insights Management Conference presentation on increasing the resilience of your supply chain. I am the speaker. My name is Lynnda Nelson. I am the president of ICOR, and you can see our contact information here. One thing to note is that I do have several case studies and audiovisual links that I'll include at the end of the presentation. Just due to the network viability here, I was not able to include the videos inside the presentation. We're going to be talking about supply chain risk, security, and continuity, and helping you to understand the nodes and links that are part of the supply chain and really the basics of supply chain. We'll also look at how you can evaluate the vulnerabilities and the capabilities of your supply chain and hopefully implement a more agile supply chain. We need to start with the definition so that we understand what we're talking about. This is a definition from the World Economic Forum that they put together on building resilient supply chains or building resilience in supply chains back in 2013. It's well worth your time to take a look at this full paper. The definition that they've provided is that supply chain resilience is the ability of the system to return to its original state, and I added in there, or stronger, after a major disruption. In my opinion, a resilient supply chain might not be interrupted at all. There are three disciplines or three primary disciplines that support building a more resilient supply chain. The first one is supply chain risk management, and they talk about demand risk, supply risk, environmental risk, process risk, and network or control risk. This is usually conducted using ISO 31000's risk management methodology. We also have supply chain continuity, which the methodology includes looking at the identification of criticality for each product, then deciding do you have a multi-source or single-source supplier, and looking at the preparedness level of the supplier itself, and then looking at what priority do you have in the suppliers list of critical suppliers, meaning are you one of their tier 1 customers? Or are you down in, tier whatever? So where do you fall in their level? You can find more information about this in ISO 22318 supply chain continuity. And when we look at supply chain security, we're looking at the ISO 28000 series, and here we're looking at cargo management, facility management, information management, and human resources management as it pertains to the supply chain. Remember that there is an overlap between each discipline, and they really need to be implemented as a framework or one total system where you're looking at supply chain risk, continuity, and security as one system. So let's begin by looking at supply chain basics. Essentially, somebody wants to buy something, which then needs to be made, which then needs to be moved from where it's made to who wants to buy it. It goes to a store in some manner, and then it needs to be delivered. It's working to reduce costs by always meeting customer service requirements as well. This is really it. You buy, you make, you move, you store, and you deliver. This is a very simple graphic illustrating an organization's supply chain consisting of 4 primary or tier 1 suppliers. You also have what they're called nodes or links. So the nodes are the circles with the ones in them, and they represent organizational risk. And then the straight lines are considered your links, which are your network risk. And then we have, in this case, 3 tiers, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And all supply chains are comprised of nodes and links. So the question becomes, well, here you have your transportation link. How is the product transported from the supplier to you? And then look at the one on the left. You have a critical supplier, the tier 1 supplier, and they've actually outsourced their supplies to 2 other suppliers. So these become your tier 2 suppliers. And then here you've got some emerging market suppliers as well. So these are newer to the marketplace. They are also very important for you to understand. And then you also have a sole or single source supplier down below. And lastly, we have some local suppliers with redundancy. But what you need to understand here is that both of these suppliers, both of your Tier 2 suppliers are actually relying on the same Tier 3 supplier. If you don't map out your supply chain, you will not be able to uncover any interdependencies that you may have with your suppliers. It's really important that you understand where your Tier 1 suppliers are getting the products they need to provide the final product. You also need to understand all sole or single source suppliers, and then understand when your suppliers rely on each other, which creates a vulnerability in your system. You also need to remember that all supply chains face risk. The more complex and global your supply chains, the greater your exposure. There's a really great study that's done under from the Deutsche Post called Insight on Risk and Resilience, and one of the quotes that they have is that the modern economy runs on interconnected global supply chains, but with distance and complexity comes new types of risk. So they've identified, and Cranfield University has identified 5 sources of supply chain risk. The first is demand risk, and this is where examples might be loss of major accounts, volatility of demand, short life cycles, concentration on consumer base. Then you may have supply risk where there's dependency on key suppliers like we just talked about, maybe a consolidation of supply markets themselves. You may have quality and management issues, and then the length and variability of lead times. When we talk about environment risk, we look at things that might be common to you for business continuity, might be natural disasters, terrorism and war, regulatory changes. They also include things like tax, duties, and quotas, as well as things like strikes where you can't get your product. In process risk, they look at manufacturing yield variability, lengthy setup times, and inflexible processes where maybe something that you need takes 6 months to create or build, for example. You're looking also at equipment reliability where there's limited capacity or bottlenecks, outsourcing of key business processes, and then network and control risk are the 5th source. We're looking at asymmetric power relationships, poor visibility along your supply chain pipeline, inappropriate rules that distort demand, and lack of collaborative planning and forecasts. And all of these, when you're looking at all of these sources of supply chain risk, are all really summed up in a pandemic risk, which we're experiencing, of course, now in April of 2020, which is why we're having this conference online. When we look at pandemic risk, it's looking at all 5 sources of supply chain risk. We look at, limited availability, all sorts of risks are combined with pandemic risk. So let's take a closer look. Looking at Resilience 360 annual risk report done by DHL, they had identified their 10 top supply chain risks that they predicted for 2019 included trade wars, driving manufacturing network restructuring, things like Brexit, new import tariffs, and other trade barriers they believe will continue to reshape manufacturing supply chains. The rising demand and fragile supply create critical raw material shortages, with political instability and supplier shutdowns likely to impact the supply of crucial raw materials such as lithium, cobalt, and I don't even know how to say this, I'll just say adamantitrile. That's my best guess. You also have recalls and safety scares which put quality under scrutiny as well. So you have stricter regulations and quality requirements will put pharmaceutical companies under pressure, for example. Also climate change, as this begins to really heat up the supply chain risks. Companies are likely to face an increasing number of weather-related disruptions in 2019, and this is forecasted to be the warmest year on record. Looking at tougher environmental regulations make polluters pay, so you may have local quality and climate change mitigation policies. They see those appearing in 2019 across the Asia Pacific region, for example. Also, economic uncertainty and structural change can put suppliers under threat. We see suppliers insolvencies rising as small producers continue to be casualties of economic uncertainty and structural change. We also saw cargo caught up in industrial unrest, and there was an early indication of industrial disputes which threatened to disrupt transport operations as well. We see hazardous transport with container ship fires. There's insufficient firefighting capabilities and a trend towards larger container ships, which puts pressure on maritime dependent supply chains. We also see battles at the border to increase wait times. So companies dependent on US, Mexico, and EU and UK lanes are likely to see increased cost and border crossing wait times. And then we've got the drone problem, where drones are becoming a problem with aviation, with increased number of safety institutes. So they see them becoming a larger supply chain risk in the future. But here we have the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. I essentially had to rewrite this presentation because when it was written back in November, obviously the pandemic was not an issue. So I went today, which is April 21st, 2020, and looked at what was in the news. The first one came from Investors Business Daily, which says supply chain management flaws ripped open by coronavirus business closures, and that coronavirus business closures are exposing weaknesses in global supply chain management, and essentially goes on to talk about how companies are trying to find ways to find alternate suppliers. And I've left these in here as titles so that you can go ahead and read these if you'd like to. The Atlantic says that the modern supply chain is snapping, and this was a month ago, back in March, that the coronavirus exposes the fragility of an economy built on outsourcing and just-in-time inventory, which we'll talk more about as well. Harvard Business Review says the coronavirus is a wake-up call for supply chain management, as procurement teams struggle to cope with the COVID-19 global pandemic. Most have been trying to keep up with the news about their global supply chains. The coronavirus has broken America's food supply. This is something that we're seeing reported more recently in April. Because commercial and consumer supply chains are different and cannot easily be transferred, enormous amount of food are going to waste. The issue is not that a lack of food. The issue is the transportation aspect. So when companies have the food, they have a buyer, as you remember seeing at the very beginning of our supply chain basics. And when the buyers no longer have a need to buy, it causes a break in the supply chain. So while we have people who are hungry and that they need the food, there's not somebody to pay for the transport of that food. And so one of the things we're seeing in the United States just this week is that some of the nonprofits are being able to fund the actual transport of the food from the manufacturer to these food banks and other suppliers who are trying to provide food to the consumer. In the Business Insider in the UK, they talk about Samsung's supply chain woes persisting, and that coronavirus is actually they had a problem already, and it's making this even worse. Supply and demand chain executives states that 75% of companies are seeing supply chain disruptions due to the coronavirus. There's a really interesting survey that you might want to take a look at under the Institute for Supply Chain Management. They're actually, I'll be quoting some of their research, but they're continuing to put out data regularly. So anything that I'm quoting here is already dated. Fortune magazine says that coronavirus should inspire businesses to prepare their supply chains for their future. And you would hope, as business continuity people, that this new risk would actually be an opportunity for you as business continuity professionals to prepare your supply chains and to make sure that supply chain management, risk management, becomes part of what you do. So this was a study, like I mentioned, from the Institute of Supply Management back when the coronavirus was still limited to China. They started doing what's the impact to the world based on this. And this study was conducted between February 22nd and March 9th, or March 5th. What they saw was that in manufacturing capacity and production, on average, suppliers were operating at 50% capacity. They also saw that the proportion of normal staffing levels in Chinese manufacturing facilities were at 56% capacity. This means they're not sending out as much product as they were prior to March. They also saw the impact on transportation and logistics, with 62% of the respondents experiencing delays in receiving orders from China, with 48% of the companies experienced delays when moving goods within China, and 46% of the companies reporting delays loading goods at the Chinese ports. When we're looking at impacts to business, what we're seeing is getting goods to market to meet customer demand, that 57% of companies reporting worsened lead times since late 2019. The financial impact saw that companies have adjusted revenue targets down an average of 5.6%, and some of them as much as 15%. They also saw supply management challenges, with more than 44% of respondents saying they do not have a plan in place to address supply chain disruption from China. This is scary. And of those that don't have a plan, 23% were currently reporting disruptions. Kind of difficult to start the planning now. Some things to consider is that they recommended you diversify your supply chain. We just looked at that, putting out a supply chain map where you could look at where your nodes are and where your transportation lands are. They said that companies that shift production to other countries or find alternative suppliers outside of China are better positioned to withstand the impact of a supply disruption. Well, this might look differently today when the supply chain disruption has moved from China and is now global. They recommend that you develop a transportation risk mitigation plan, or how about a business continuity plan for your supply chain? Due to limited transportation availability, air freight and container ship, consider impacted lead times and alternate solutions. And of course, if you haven't already planned, now is the time. Supply chain disruption is becoming the norm, and it is critical to make time to develop your plan. And I would certainly hope that supply chain management is part of your business continuity planning. They have an update of their study. This one was done between March 15th and April 14th. What they found that lead times is that average lead times for inputs are at least twice as long as compared to normal operations. For Asian, your 222% increase for China, 217% for Korea, and 209% for Japan. European is up to 201%, and domestically sourced inputs are still double at 200%. Compared to the end of 2019, 86% of respondents report that lead times for inputs from China have pushed out. 74% report longer lead times for European inputs, and between 34 and 44% report lengthening of lead times for inputs sourced from North American countries. Through the end of April, 69% of the respondents expect lead times to lengthen for U.S. inputs, and 57% of respondents expect longer lead times from Canadian or Mexican suppliers. Europe is expected to be the most impacted, with 85% of respondents expecting longer lead times from European inputs. Looking at inventory, firms are reporting that operations in North America have or are likely have enough inventory to support their current operations. U.S. said 71% and Mexico and Canada said 64%. Beyond April and into quarter 2 and quarter 3, while uncertainty increases, respondent confidence remains relatively steady that inventory will be sufficient to support domestic and global operations, with Europe being an exception. Nearly 2/3, or 64% of respondents, say that their firm's input inventories have been adjusted in response to the coronavirus. And I want to mention here is that this was an update done as of before April 14th, and it is now April 21st, and we are seeing in the United States that manufacturing plants are being closed and closed indefinitely due to the coronavirus of the workers happening there. So this may look very different in a month from now. When we're looking at manufacturing capacity, domestic manufacturing, they said, as of April 14th, is operating at 79% of normal capacity, with Chinese and European manufacturing being at about 1/2 to normal capacity, 53 and 50% respectively. And as looking at talent, well, here we go back to the manufacturing example that I just gave. If half of your workers are out due to the coronavirus, what's happening to your talent capacity? In an already tight talent market, the majority of respondents report that their organizations will likely delay hiring. So here you have people sick, but you're unable to hire replacements because you don't know how long they're going to be sick for or if they'll return. But you've got 33% of the companies reducing hours, and then another 24% actually reducing headcount. This is especially happening in the restaurant business, for example. In late February, respondents reported that staffing levels in China stood at about 56% of normal, but because they were recovering in March, levels had recovered to about 82% of normal. So we would hope that in the United States, for example, that May would look maybe similar to March looking in China. So supply chain risk has been a major unintended consequence of really two trends in recent decades, looking at globalization of the supply chain combined with lean production. So let's take a look at this jacket. This is an example from Cranfield University. To make this jacket for the UK market, the Hong Kong garment producer Li and Feng ordered materials from factories in 5 countries and had them delivered to Thailand, where the jacket was stitched together. Using a network of websites, Li Feng stays in touch with its worldwide suppliers and can compress the time it takes to get the items into stores. So here you've got China is the world's largest producer of cotton that made the liner. You've got Thailand, the leading exporter of imitation fur, ringing the hood. You've got Taiwan, which specializes in making the material for outdoor clothing, producing the shell and the fleece. You've got Japan, the globe's biggest producer of stainless steel zippers, putting teeth in this zipper. And then we have Germany, which gave the world the snap fastener in the 1880s, sending the snaps. And then it goes back to Thailand to be stitched together. Really driven by the quest for lower manufacturing costs or access to specialist capabilities, the increasing willingness of companies to source materials and components from around the world has greatly increased the potential points of supply chain weakness, especially as some key production sites are now located in more regions more vulnerable to natural disasters. And this is what that's normally looked at, is that environmental risk of natural disasters, but here you can see the pandemic risk would impact the manufacturing of this coat as well. So there are some business trends that have changed supply chain risks. One is a lack of transparency. Companies don't know the routes and transport modes their suppliers used. You need to see a map. They don't know where their products are along their route, so they don't understand the transport routes, and they aren't aware of where their suppliers get their own components and materials. Managers are often surprised on how many parts rely on the same few suppliers upstream. So some of the trends that make supply chains more efficient is outsourcing. More outsourcing generally means a higher risk of disruption, as well as an increase in quality-related risks, as more activity falls outside the direct control of the end product manufacturer. We saw specialization in the code. Companies increasingly tend to focus on certain tasks where they have a competitive advantage. This necessarily leads to an increased outsourcing of other tasks and can increase your exposure to particular disruptive events. Digitization makes supply chains more vulnerable to cyber threats. This is maybe something you haven't really considered. There is a whole risk category dealing with digitization and the fact that people can hack into your supply chain and steal your supplies as they're in transport because they've tied into the cyber end of this. You've got increasingly homogeneous strategies and business models, which means events are likely to affect many players in a given sector. This makes it hard to find alternative sources of the supply in the event of a disruption. And then you've got the intensity of competition. This generally increases the urge to prioritize cost minimization compared to resilience. So all of these things bring with them the increased risk of disruption, reminding us that there is a clear trade-off between the minimization of cost in the short term and the resilience of your supply chain. This emphasis to build lean supply chains and keeping inventories and buffer stocks as low as possible has also increased your risk. Because you've got little slack or inventory, you've got limited flexibility because you've got a consolidated vendor base, and your reliance on a single thread or one supply chain segment option, which really, of course, makes you more efficient, but doesn't necessarily make you very agile. So the opposite of that is providing more flexibility and the emphasis on building a more agile supply chain. Here is where the focus is on customer satisfaction versus productivity and cost, where you can maximize your autonomy and get a faster response, and you don't commit to a final product until the actual demand is known, which reduces some of your risk. So the World Economic Forum back in 2013 stated that more than 80% of companies are concerned about supply chain resilience. And my guess is here they're really talking about supply chain risk. There is a challenge when organizations all through the world kind of substitute the word resilience for risk. So I want you to think risk here. So let's look at how to manage risks of lean with agile. Agile supply chain management prioritizes adaptability. It's for organizations that want to quickly adapt to changing circumstances. This method makes it easier to adjust sourcing, logistics, and sales in response to factors including economic swings, technology changes, and customer demand. As agile supply chain typically results in shorter lead times, it's also quick to respond to customers. So when something unexpected happens, such as a regular supplier not being able to fulfill an order, the system enables flexibility. You can also respond more quickly to new market opportunities with an agile supply chain. And you can read more about this by looking at the conspecte.com and their supply chain management, agile supply chain management link here. So here where you've got supply characteristics on the left and demand characteristics on the bottom, tied with long lead time versus short lead time, and predictable versus unpredictable. If you have short lead time and unpredictable supplies, then you really want to be more agile. If you have long lead time and very predictable, then you can go lean, and because that gives you more flexibility with that. So you need to understand the supply and demand characteristics of your supply chain in order to decide which aspects to go lean and which aspects to go agile. When you're building a more agile supply chain, you're looking at this idea of agility or readiness to change. An agile strategy is more responsive to a volatile marketplace and where the strategy is totally demand driven. And here is where the manufacturer has the opportunity during a pandemic, for example, if they're more agile, to adjust how they are manufacturing. Also, consumer buying patterns change, and they continue to change at a very rapid pace. And these changes directly impact supply chain management as well. Just look at the changes in buying patterns for PPEs over the last 30 to 45 days, completely changed. And remember that agile supply chains are based on the sensitivity to consumers' demand, which allows them to ramp up or back down as needed. So agile methods involve regular testing of products and ideas within the development phase, Teams assemble in scrums just like you use with typical project management, which look to build products fast and test them quickly with their customers. Similarly, building an agile team within supply chain management can encourage the creation of projects that can better align supplier output with end customer need. When you look at the fact that we're trying to have companies that manufacture cars, for example, change to manufacturing respirators, that would need more of an agile supply chain approach. So that it's recommended that you build an agile team in your supply chain and use the agile project management scrum approach to better align supplier output with end customer need. Also looking at rewarding efficiency as well as tolerating failure. Encourage staff and suppliers to learn from mistakes, move on, and focus on continuing the partnership so that they don't look elsewhere to find the magic answer somewhere else. You should also build agile supplier contracts. A flexible supply chain requires redundancy, so building multiple relationships within a range of suppliers, meaning multi-sourcing. We all know about this in business continuity. We're all trying to build in redundancy in our supply chains. This can include buyback contracts, zero volume contracts with suppliers in some of the lower tiers. This is why it's also important to understand how your supply chain is tiered. And use smart contracts. Realize the potential of blockchain. Use contracts enforced using digital technologies as well. The decentralized nature of operations allows the verification of the other party's fulfillment without the need for a third party. When you look at the comparison of Lean and Agile, this has certainly helped to make some intuitive sense about the concept of the Agile supply chain. But it is also helpful to have some kind of theoretical underpinning of the Agile supply model. So Professor Alan Harrison of Cranfield University proposed this sort of framework all the way back in 1999 for building a more agile supply chain, which was perhaps the earliest theoretical attempt at the framework. There's 4 components of the framework. The first one is virtual integration. Virtual integration is characterized by informal and flexible and dynamic relationships between the divisional units and different sectors of the supply chain. The governance of each integration does not centrally control the supply chain operations. Rather, it operates or it supports and facilitates larger or overall supply chain initiatives, which from many parts of the supply chain can and should benefit. The virtual integration also provides senior management with a method for supporting and steering direction on the most important direction. As the structures and processes have been kept minimum in the virtual integration and individual unit involvement remains fully empowered, the supply chain can be more agile and responsive. When you're looking at market sensitivity, an agile supply chain needs to understand market sensitivity. This means that the supply chain's internal measures, whatever it may be, are sourced directly from and linked closely with the external market that the supply chain operates. Every measure must be immediately or ultimately linked to the consumers in the marketplace, and the POS means the point of sale. This means linking internal customers and external customers and all the ultimate end consumers as well. We also need improved process alignment or integration. An agile supply chain will require a higher level of integration between internal operational processes such as sales, forecasting, production planning, sourcing, and delivery. How fast the supply chain can react to the market change is dependent on the speed of changes in many of those internal processes. Business improvement will only make sense when it responds to the changing condition or the changing directions in the market. And lastly, an agile supply chain is often dynamic network based. Looking at the agile supply chain's architecture, managers need to clarify how the participating members of the agile supply chain are concerned with each other. In this dynamic network, the ties between suppliers and buyers and amongst the suppliers themselves are much looser than that of a stable network. The network relies on more sophisticated information systems with a high level of information disclosure between the parties, whereas an instant switch of connection can be easily established if required by the sudden change of market. For those reasons, the dynamic network is a more superior form of networking for agile operations. So how can you reduce centralization? Because we know that your organizational structure impacts your agility. So to build agility, the supply chain structure needs agile operations, and they operate best with a more flat structure versus those taller hierarchies. Obviously, as a business continuity person, you probably don't have a lot of impact or say on how your organization is organized, but you need to understand that the flatter is going to be better. So consider the organization external connections and how the whole supply chain is networked together. And I would certainly hope that you can do some of this via your business impact analysis, especially if you're using the Agile BIA approach. And you can look at just the supply chain as one of those ways of reviewing the projects. You also need to implement a multi-divisional structure. So concentrate on the product, the service, and geographical area, and then allow units to adapt to local needs. This is especially important during a pandemic response time. And of course, we always say encourage empowerment. A high degree of empowerment and less formal rules are also positive factors to the Agile structure itself. So how can you increase the resilience of your supply chain? The first thing you need to do is develop a holistic view on supply chain risk management. You need to have strategies and targets of the procurement and risk management division. Make sure they're intertwined with one organizational unit responsible for supply chain risk management. And here is where you might be the business continuity department might become the piece of that really joins together risk management and supply and procurement. And make sure that risk management perspectives are embedded in the purchasing process. Remember that this white paper was written by an insurance company, so they're going to be using the word risk probably more than they're going to be using the business continuity aspect. So design your supply chain with an explicit risk management focus, and make sure your business continuity also focuses on supply chain risk. You need to use IT tools that enable your company to perform a thorough supply chain risk analysis as well as risk monitoring. There are tons of tools out there, and I would be really surprised if your organization doesn't manage its supply chain with some sort of a tool. This helps companies to identify and assess risks and gives them the opportunity to react rapidly in the case of an incident. Leading companies have implemented risk management measures and business continuity management processes. Thirdly, focus on transparency. We talked about transparency earlier, being able to map out your transportation nodes as well as your different supplier tiers. You need to have detailed knowledge on the most critical exposures in order to design adequate responses. This also allows information to be provided rapidly so you can react quickly, and helps you to be aware of your vulnerabilities in order to focus on the most important parts of your supply chain. And it's recommended that you concentrate on those products where supply chain disruption would have the biggest financial impact. This is another example of how to map your supply and customer change. Here you're in the middle is layer 0. You've got the organization, and you've identified 3 layers. In your layer 1, you've identified 3 suppliers. 2 of them are critical and one's a tier 2. You might call them tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or critical, important, whatever levels you call them. And then you look at that supplier 4 delivers to both suppliers 1 and 2. Suppliers 5 delivers to supplier 1. Supplier 6 delivers to supplier 2. Supplier 7 is delivering to both supplier 2 and 3. And supplier 8 is supplying to supplier 3. So if you were looking at scope even for your business continuity management system, you would need to include all of layer 2 suppliers because they all contribute to your critical suppliers. When you're looking at your distributors, So here is where your organization distributes to distributor 1 and they distribute to customer 1 and 2. The organization itself delivers directly to customers 2 and 3, and then the organization distributes to distributor 2, goes to customer 4. So here is where you can also look at where are our strengths. At customer 2 has 2 ways of getting your product, which might make customer 2 very important to you as well. You need to gain a deeper understanding of your risks. Conduct a risk assessment to identify the probability of a risk of a supply chain disruption and its financial impact. In fact, you might not even need to do that because right in the middle of this pandemic, my guess is that your organization is gaining a deeper understanding of the risks in real time. But if you are doing a risk assessment, you should consider the difficulty of detecting the risk up front, and maybe the lead time available between detection and the impact. So here is where, for the pandemic, for example, there was a need detected all the way back in February when we started seeing issues in China. So hopefully your organization had some time to consider the impact as they moved to Europe and all of Asia and then to North and South America. And what is the cost of recovering from this incident as well? And then looking at the investment required to put your mitigation strategies in place. Like I've mentioned before, my guess is that you're going to have an opportunity to have an impact on supply chain from a business continuity perspective, and maybe put mitigation strategies in place that perhaps were not accepted previously. You should also take a network-centric perspective. Simple supply chains can often switch seamlessly to an alternate source. Alternatively, in some emerging market locations, you may only have a few alternatives available. So consider how disruptions of small, inexpensive parts can be critical to the overall product. And again, if you go back to that mapping, you might really find an example of how you can identify those. Remember that supply chain risks can't be fully understood without considering the network that they affect. And make strong business continuity management the foundation. Of course, I'm sure that you would all agree with this, that you should extend your business continuity strategies outside the wall of the organization. Expect key suppliers to have their own business continuity programs in place, and conduct regular checks and audits to ensure that they are in place and that they work. So successful risk management programs are based on strong business continuity programs. You should also use all available data. Develop processes for systematic collection and analysis of the supply chain risk data. You should also use multiple data sources from external data providers, public sources, customers, as well as your suppliers. And then integrate this data into your everyday operations management, because organizations with an earlier, clearer view of potentially disruptive incidents can respond more effectively to them. And you should also, of course, collaborate within and beyond the organization. Set up a cross-functional war room to manage supply chain disruptions. Create an alignment between your supply chain partners. Ensure internal alignment and effectively share information. Because clear communication and effective collaboration is vital if companies are to spot, avoid, and respond to all of your supply chain risks. Of course, build in resilience. Effectiveness of the response is dependent upon plans in place and risks mitigated prior to the incident. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. Use strategies like dual sourcing for critical components and engineer flexible product designs that permit component substitution. Create postponement techniques that allow inventories of unfinished products to be allocated to different end users or end uses according to need. And of course, implement segmented transportation modes while creating alternative routes when problems strike. And this all relies on having the right culture. Strong supply chain risk management is as much about organizational culture as it is about processes. Employees are committed and recognized for focusing on risk reduction alongside their cost, quality, and delivery targets. This is really important. I don't know how to overstate this, that leadership drives this commitment and your people or your staff are rewarded for measures that prevent a disruption and not just for heroic work to fix problems that have already occurred. When we're looking at risk and return, the ROI, investment in more resilient supply chains doesn't just reduce the impact of disruptive incidents, it also helps to boost overall business performance. So I've included some videos that I really recommend that you take a look at. This is not a real exciting one, but it does talk about how to plan for pandemics for supply chains, and it's from the Robert H. Smith School of Business. This is a YouTube video that has a slight bit of marketing in it, but it's really decent. It talks about how to strengthen your supply chain. And risk and resilience in the supply chain talks about suppliers, logistics, and the customer base. And each of these videos, by the way, are less than 4 minutes long, so they don't take a lot of time, but they do have some decent information. There's a lot of other good videos on YouTube, but they're much longer. You're looking at things, 45 minutes or an hour longer. We also recommend you take a look at some of these case studies. When we look at Starbucks versus McDonald's and how they manage strategic operations and supply chain management between those two organizations, L'Oreal is a really interesting video here on, actually I think this is actually an article and it's part of their website, a case study on supply chain excellence. They also have Zara's Agile Supply Chain, talks about how that actually their supply chain is a source of their competitive advantage. And then Toyota, Forbes.com has put together, it's all the way from 2010, but it looks at how they manage technology risk. Just to conclude, the management of supply chain risk, security, and continuity each contribute to building a more resilient supply chain. Supply chain resilience is increased when there is an intentional effort to understand the nodes and links in the supply chain, which increases transparency. When the organization uses a network approach to reduce silos within and outside the organization, it has an increased visibility and agility to respond to risk and potential interruption of the supply chain. And implementing agile supply chain management is a key factor in building a more resilient supply chain. This is where I would ask you for questions. In this case, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or would like to share how your organization is managing its supply chain during this pandemic. We would love to be able to publish something where we could share what's been done by different companies.